This DeLorean is missing something that is absolutely critical for Doc Brown and Marty McFly to use it as a time machine. And I'm not talking about the flux capacitor. Hi there, Rick DeBrule with another chapter in the automotive evolution, here once again at the Martin Auto Museum, a great collection of more than 170 cars, each one telling a different story, some about the importance of the automobile and some about the importance of the automobile in pop culture. And that's exactly what we have right here with this DeLorean. But before we get to that, make sure you like and subscribe. And in the comments below, keep me honest, let me know what I got right and what I screwed up on. I want to hear what you think. Now, before we get to that thing that's missing on this DeLorean, we need to talk about DeLorean the car, and more importantly, DeLorean the man. John DeLorean rose to prominence as the head of the Pontiac division at General Motors. In fact, he was the youngest ever head of a division at General Motors, running Pontiac at just 40 years old. And he was there at a very important time. And to come up with a very important concept, he was really able to bring performance into the Pontiac world. He was responsible for shepherding the GTO concept, bringing it out to the public. He was there when the Pontiac Firebird came out to the public. Now, granted, this had evolved from the Chevrolet Camaro, but he was responsible for shepherding it through as a Pontiac. He later went on to run Chevrolet. Now, he actually took over Chevrolet when they were having profitability problems, build quality problems. He did a great job of making them profitable again, having a better system of putting cars out. Now, there were some hitches along the way. For example, when he was at Chevrolet, he was responsible for shepherding the Vega program, the Chevy Vega program. While they sold a lot of cars, they had an awful lot of build quality programs. As time went on, the car got better. Ultimately, remember the Cosworth Vega? It was a great, cool car, but by then it was too little too late. So General Motors and John DeLorean ultimately parted ways. Was he fired? Did he quit? Depends upon who you listen to and what the particular story is at the time. But whatever the story, when he left, he decided he didn't want to run a car company. He wanted to be a car company. He wanted to have his own name on a car, have a DeLorean, and he began to sow the seeds for that, ultimately getting together with the country Ireland and saying, well, if you'll put up the money, we'll build a factory in your country, and the two of us will get together and build great cars. And thus was born the DeLorean. All right, let's get back to DeLorean the car. John DeLorean, once again, connects up with the country of Ireland. They give him a loan. They give him some space for a plant. They ultimately are able to supply workers. He's able to get this spectacular body designed by Giugiaro. He does come up with an engine, not the one he wanted. He originally wanted a Wankel engine, ultimately comes up with an engine that is supplied by what's called PRV, which was a combination of Peugeot, Renault, and Volvo, and they create this car. But John DeLorean learns very quickly that it's one thing to come up with the idea, and it's one thing to build a car when you have a big company like General Motors behind you, but to build a car on your own is much more complicated. And initially, the cars that they created in Ireland had all kinds of build problems. Some of them were from the design. Others were simply the fact that the workers had never built cars before, and as a result, they had to fix an awful lot of problems. Yes, the car looked great, but it had all kinds of problems. In fact, one owner back then said, you know, the car sucks, but it sure looks great driving by. The weak link in the DeLorean, well, it's back here in the engine compartment. Originally, they wanted to have a Wankel engine back here. They couldn't make that work. They wanted it to be mid-engine. It ended up being rear engine. And the engine that they ended up with was called a PRV. It stood for Peugeot, Renault, Volvo. 2.85 liters, V6. It's actually a pretty solid engine, runs very well. It just doesn't deliver much horsepower, 130 horsepower coming out of this. And to be honest with you, that wasn't the only problem. There were some other issues around it. For example, the alternator. Well, the alternator, as it turns out, in the early cars didn't produce enough electricity to charge the battery. There's a pretty famous story about Johnny Carson, who was one of the initial investors in the DeLorean Motor Company. He got his car and got stalled on the side of the road because his battery ran dead, all because the alternator wasn't charging enough. That's a problem when you're trying to create a car company, a public relations problem. Well, with only 130 horsepower, it's not surprising that performance was a problem for the DeLorean. I mean, you look at the Corvette, it could do 0 to 60 in 8.1 seconds. The Porsche 911 of its day, this is the base model, well, that was 0 to 60 in about 6.3 seconds. And then you came to the DeLorean, 0 to 60 in 10.5 seconds. And when you realize this costs significantly more than the Corvette, a lot of people thought, I want more performance for less money. So why have a stainless steel body? Well, ultimately, when you get right down to it, it was a marketing gimmick. I mean, yeah, it looked cool. It was very different, very interesting. Everything else was painted in its day, so it made the car stand out. But it really wasn't significantly better or different. In fact, there were a lot of problems associated with it because you couldn't finish the paint, you couldn't hide any particular flaws in it. Scratches, dents, they all showed much more so with this car. There was also in the beginning the story that, well, if you needed to fix it up, to polish it up, all you had to do was, use a Brillo pad or steel wool. It turned out that really wasn't the case, because when you would polish it or try to polish it with steel wool, it could leave little embedded iron fibers into the body surface that then cause tiny rust spots to occur in the body. There's better ways to do it, synthetic materials, and today there are companies that do a great job of finishing and refinishing this particular style. But once again, in its day, it looked cool, and that's ultimately the primary goal of creating a stainless steel body on the DeLorean. Another great design element are the Gull-wing doors. Necessary? No, but they sure look cool. I mean, they were first used on the Mercedes 300 SL back in the 1950s. We've seen them on a number of cars since then. But in the 1980s, it was pretty unique to be able to put these on. Now, there is an advantage in this particular car with these Gull-wing doors, and that's the fact that if you notice, this car is actually very low. So having the Gull-wing doors lift up like this allows you to easily enter so you don't have to duck your head down. So while it really wasn't essential to the design of the car, it actually made it easier to get in and out. So these Gull-wing doors do have a very practical purpose after all. Certain design aspects of the DeLorean were evolutionary as time went on. This fuel filler cap right here is a perfect example. This only exists in the early run of the DeLoreans, and this hid the place where you put the gasoline into the car. It held a locked gas cap because, gasoline was valuable back then. We're coming off the fuel wars of the late 1970s, early 1980s. But as time went along, they decided to change that, and they simply hid it underneath the hood, and in fact got rid of that locking fuel cap. And as time evolved, they also got rid of these creases right here, and the later models actually had a DeLorean badge on the front of the car. Another thing that changed is in the early models, they had a windshield antenna mounted in here. It was embedded into the glass, which is pretty common back in those days, but it didn't work very well. There was a lot of static, other problems. So initially, they decided to mount it in the front fender. Well, initially it was just a whip antenna coming up, then it became retractable. Ultimately, it ended up going behind the driver. So depending upon when you bought your DeLorean, your radio antenna ended up in different locations. But even the cool design, the interesting style, the great story of John DeLorean, it probably would not have been enough to cement this car into the psyche of the American public had it not been for Back to the Future, that iconic moment when Marty McFly looks at Doc Brown and says,
"Are you telling me that you built a time machine out of a DeLorean?"
That absolutely was truly iconic. An iconic moment, not just in the movie world, but also in the automotive world. And it cemented those two things together. In fact, there's a group of people who grew up in the 80s, and for them, this is one of the ultimate cars. They don't care about the fact that it doesn't have performance. It is part of a trilogy of movies that is as famous as perhaps any other over the years. And the interesting story is they originally weren't planning to use even a DeLorean, any kind of car. The original plan was to use a refrigerator in the movie. Well, needless to say, they decided to have kids get into a refrigerator would be promoting the wrong thing. They somehow came upon the DeLorean and decided this was going to be the car, this was going to be the look we were going for. And ultimately, it proved to be perfect for both the movie and for the car. And this has become a very collectible car as a result of that. In fact, sometimes you see at car auctions and for sale, you see people who've taken a regular stock DeLorean and converted it into a Back to the Future style with the Mr. Fusion in the back or all the flux capacitor inside. It's all great, and it's taken this car, this DeLorean, and taken it to the next level of collectability. All right, now it's time to tell the story of what's missing on this DeLorean that would have been so important to Marty McFly and Doc Brown as they were traveling through time. And to tell the story, we have to go back to the 1980s and talk about the fact that there was a major gas crunch going on. Remember the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit? That's when it was implemented. And as another part of the rules, they also said that cars that were being built could only have a speedometer that read up to 85 miles an hour. which means if they had a truly stock DeLorean, they would never have known when they were hitting the magic 88 miles an hour. So for the movie, well, they did a little movie magic. They put an overlay on the dashboard that showed a 95-mile-an-hour speedometer. So they were able to see when they finally hit 88 miles an hour. But if this had been a real, live, honest-to-goodness DeLorean, well, with a flux capacitor, they would never have known when they were hitting 88. So what ultimately went wrong with DeLorean? What led to its demise? Probably a number of factors. Number one, trying to achieve an amazing goal with, well, limited resources. And even though there were millions of dollars involved, it still wasn't quite enough to try to create a car company like, General Motors, Ford, or even some of the smaller companies. They just didn't have the deep enough pockets to be able to keep it going. Remember, John DeLorean had big plans. I mean, ultimately they built about 9,000 of these, but it wasn't enough. And they couldn't overcome a lot of those early build problems. In fact, they actually had to have a center in the United States that the cars would come to, and they would be tweaked and changed and modified, so before they got to the final customer's hands, they were a little bit better. Now, the car's build quality did evolve as time went along, but once again, it wasn't enough by the time the second year of production came around. And then, of course, there was the saga of John DeLorean. Ultimately, he was charged with trafficking in drugs, trying to come up with enough money to keep the factory afloat. He was even on videotape trying to do a drug deal. Interestingly enough, though, ultimately the jury found that he had been entrapped, that he had been brought into it. He really wasn't a drug dealer, that he actually had really a neighbor who dragged him into this deal. And they said the federal government had entrapped him, and so the jury found him not guilty. But once again, to be honest with you, by then it was too little too late, even probably been able to get the money. The car just wasn't strong enough, the factory wasn't strong enough, and perhaps John DeLorean had overshot his mark, trying to build too many cars too soon. And as a result, the DeLorean, well, is just a footnote in history. But what a great footnote, with this beautiful Giugiaro design, and of course that connection to Back to the Future, and then throw in a scandal. Well, that's what makes this car truly a collectible.